Hi everyone. Today we're going to be discussing section 1.3, which is on collecting sample data. Okay. So again, with all the guided lecture notes, I do like to put a general citation up top, just so you know which text we're referring to, obviously the text in our class, in which section. However, if you do go through the text, you will see additional citations on many of the problems, because a lot of the examples actually deal with real world data, which I think is great. So if you go through the text and you're reading through as part of your assignment and preparing for our lecture and the homework, make sure you check out the other citations too and recognize those there as well. So with collecting sample data, we do have to be careful with how we collect it, and there's different ways to collect sample data. So that's really what we're going to focus on in this section. The goal of every statistical study is to collect data and then use that data to make a decision, right? So that's really what we're trying to do. We're trying to collect data, learn about what's going on, maybe with a certain population or something happening in the world, and then we can use that data to make a decision. That's really our goal. So it's nice when we have data, but really the point is that we actually do something with the data. So we try to measure things that are meaningful and that, again, we can hopefully make positive changes with. Any decision you make using the results of a statistical study is only as good as the process used to obtain the data. When the process is flawed, the resulting decision is questionable. And in fact, sampling data in the correct way is key. If the sample data is not collected in an appropriate way, the data may be utterly useless. And this is actually really important. And we'll talk about what's correct and what's not correct in this lecture. The main idea, though, is that when we collect sample data, our sample should be representative of the population. So for instance, if I'm looking at, let's say, Mount Wachusett Community College, and I want to get the opinion of all students on campus, but my sample only contains students in the nursing major, then that's not a good sample. That sample would represent how the nursing students are feeling, but it doesn't actually represent how all students are feeling at the college. So when we sample, we need to make sure our sample is collected in such a way that it represents the population we're trying to study. So that's really important. We also want to sample it in some sort of random way. So there's a lot of different ways that we can randomly sample, which we're going to talk about in this section. But the important thing is that we don't do it in just a convenient way, right? So for instance, if I'm trying to figure out how students at Mount Wachusett Community College really feel, and I only survey the students in my classes, that's convenient, right? It's easy for me. I could just ask my own students, I see them, I talk to them, but it's not a good sample. It doesn't actually represent students overall on campus, right? So there's two things we're really going to talk about. How do we sample and the different strategies used? But the overall arching idea is that our sample should always represent the population, and they should be collected in some sort of randomized way. So not just making it, the easiest way to collect the data. It should be done in a very thoughtful way that represents the population. So when we're designing statistical studies, what's the general process? So the first thing is to identify the variable or variables of interest. So what are you focusing on? What are the questions that you're trying to answer? What are you interested in? What's the topic? And then, of course, what population are you studying? The second step is to develop a detailed plan for collecting the data. So this is really probably the most important part. If your data is bad, no matter how much calculation you do, it doesn't matter because the data was not good to begin with. So you need good data. And if you use a sample, it needs to represent the population. Obviously, after that, we collect the data. And then we're going to learn how to describe the data. I'm sorry, I'm missing a U here. This should be using descriptive statistic techniques. So we'll start learning about that in chapter 2. So doing calculations with the data, things like finding the average or finding the mode and so on. Then we're going to take all that information and we're going to interpret it. So we're going to interpret the data and make decisions about the population using inferential statistics. And this is what we're going to progress to at the end of the course, things like confidence intervals and hypothesis testing. And of course, we're also going to identify any possible errors. Whenever we're doing statistics, it's not 100% guarantee, unfortunately. So we don't really prove things. We can be confident in our conclusion, so we can feel strongly about our conclusion that this is the correct conclusion, but I can never 100% prove something. And that usually has to do with the idea that we're sampling data. We don't often have the entire population, or there could be mistakes along the way. We're human, we make errors. We try not to, of course, right? We do our best not to. But we do want to be careful that there could be errors, and where could the possible errors be? And again, we'll talk about these later in the course. So statistical studies can either be one of two things. They can be an observational study, or they can be an experiment. So these are the two main categories that they fall into. So the first one is an observational study. And in an observational study, researchers do not influence the responses. They simply observe and measure characteristics of interest of a part of the population, but they don't try to change anything. So these are things like surveys is a perfect example. So we're just surveying people, or we're conducting a poll, we're trying to get opinions. Or maybe we're taking data, how many hours a week do you work, right? How much money do you make? So we're asking questions and we're looking for answers, typically in an observational study. So we're just observing, we're collecting the data. In an experiment, we're actually trying to change something or test something. Usually it's a new product, so often maybe a new medication or something like that. So in an experiment, a researcher deliberately applies a treatment before observing the responses. Okay, so for observational study, again, in general, you're going to be thinking about things like a survey, right? So just surveying people, getting opinions, collecting basic information, maybe their salary, their age, and so on. In an experiment, you're actually trying to really test a treatment and then observe what happens. So when we do that, we typically have two groups. So we'll have one group that does not get the treatment and another group that does get the treatment. And we're trying to see if there actually is a significant change within those two groups. So in performing an experiment, a treatment is applied to part of the population, and that group is called the treatment group. And then we observe their responses or their characteristics, whatever we're trying to test. And another population is typically called the control group, and they get no treatment. The subjects in both groups are called experimental units. And in many cases, subjects in the control group are given what's called a placebo, which is a harmless fake treatment that's made to look like the real treatment. So a lot of times people call it like a sugar pill. So if you're trying to test, let's say, a new medication. So let's say you have a group of people and everybody has high blood pressure, and you're trying to test a blood pressure medication. You would, in a systematic way, so we'll talk about how to do it, but you would break your two groups up. One group would actually get the real medication, and then the other group typically gets a placebo. So they would get a pill that looks like they're getting the medication, but it actually doesn't have any medicine in it. It's usually like a sugar pill or something that would be inert, right? It's not going to cause any change. And the reason we do that is because we don't want people in the group to know if they are or are not getting the actual medication. Because what can happen is someone who knows they're receiving the medication may just start to feel better because they kind of have a more positive feeling that they're going to feel better, right? So our mind is an amazing thing. So we have to be careful. So a lot of times we'll give a placebo, not always, but a placebo to one group so that the group may not know if they're actually getting the new drug or not. Okay. And then the responses of both groups can be compared and studied. In most cases, it's good to use the same number of subjects for each group, right? Ideally. All right, so let's determine whether the two examples are observational studies or experiments. So in the first example, we have researchers study the effect of vitamin D supplementation among patients with antibody deficiency or frequent respiratory tract infections. To perform the study, 70 patients receive 400 units of vitamin D daily for 1 year, and another group receives a placebo daily. So notice here, the researchers are physically giving a medication, or in this case, a vitamin, to one group and a placebo to another group. So those researchers are becoming part of that study, right? They're trying to change things. They're trying to influence it, right? They're giving one group a vitamin and the other group not a vitamin. That's an experiment. So here we have an experiment. In example B, we see researchers conduct a study to determine how confident Americans are in the U.S. economy. To perform the study, researchers call 3,040 U.S. adults and ask them to rate the current U.S. economic conditions and whether the U.S. economy is getting better or worse. So notice they're conducting some sort of survey or poll. The researchers are not influencing it in any way. They're not telling people how to answer or giving them additional information. They're just asking for their opinion or how they feel about a topic. So they are simply observing. So that is an observational study. And experiments too don't have to always be with medication, although we think of that as like the easiest example, but it could even be something like maybe testing the meditation and how that affects people with anxiety, right? So we could be doing maybe a trial on how meditation can work for someone, or maybe we're doing a weight loss program and we're testing exercise versus nutrition or something like that. So it doesn't have to be just medication, although that tends to be the easiest field that we think of. And again, things don't always have to be with people either. So when we're doing research, our population could also be items. So, right, maybe we're looking at manufacturing plants and we're seeing if items are defective or not. So we may survey or take a sample of items from a plant and just test to see if they're defective or if they work, right? So it doesn't have to always be people here when we do observational studies and experiments.